Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 216.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terri, I finally have the episode that I mentioned I was going to do however many episodes ago and hadn't got around to doing it because it is one of those marathon episodes with Rangan Chatterjee on his podcast, Feel Better, Live More. And it is with Gabrielle Lyon. And I'm not even going to bother telling you the bite-size episode because I just went straight into the full one. In fact, I did listen to the bite-size one, but I decided, no, I'm going to listen to the full one. So that's called The Critical Importance of Strength Training and Eating More Protein with Dr Gabrielle Lyon, which will come as no surprise to anyone who knows anything about Gabrielle Lyon. But Dr Gabrielle Lyon is, the blurb from Rangan's website, is a family medicine and osteopathic doctor who has specialised in geriatric care. What she's seen and learned as an end-of-life physician has led her to investigate the importance of skeletal muscle as a means for people to live longer, stronger and better lives. She now focuses her practice on what she calls muscle-centric medicine. And a little add-on, her book is called Forever Strong, and I downloaded that on Audible today. Haven't listened to it yet, obviously, but that's how taken I was with what she had to say. But yes, it's the best part of 2 hours, this episode. So there's a lot packed in and I will race through. I try to cherry pick as much as I can. You know what it's like with these super interesting podcast episodes. You want to sort of try and cram in as much as you can. But I really recommend that if anything I touch on interests you, just go and listen to it because she is really, really interesting and has all sorts of interesting things to say. But Rangan introduces her by saying that she believes the biggest problem with our health these days is not that we carry too much fat, but that we don't carry enough muscle. She actually phrases it in a slightly different way, but we'll get to that later. He also says that a lot of people think about gaining muscle as being important just to tone up and look better, get buff, but that it is far more important for other reasons, including reducing sarcopenia, protecting our skeleton, improving mobility and balance, and reducing our risk of falls as we get older. It helps us change our metabolism, reduces insulin resistance, reduces risk of developing chronic disease, and also reduces the risk of dementia. These are things that we've both touched on. And I know the last episode where you were talking about exercise, you were talking specifically about the dementia risk, weren't you? He does warn us, though, that she doesn't sugarcoat stuff and that the things she recommends will be hard work. So I'm like, uh-oh. So she kicks off by saying that everyone is focused on obesity these days, yet we haven't been successful in dealing with it. You would think, she says, that we would get better at treating a disease that has been increasing for decades, but actually we've gotten worse. The point of change, and there's lots of direct quotes from her in here, she said lots of great things. The point of change comes from asking the right questions. And she believes we've been asking the wrong questions and trying to solve the wrong problem. We are not over fat, we are under muscled. That's how she puts it. Metabolic diseases start in skeletal muscle first, yet we've been obsessed with obesity. And she says she thinks it's been the biggest oversight in medicine to date. So pretty, she packs her punches. And they go on to talk a little bit about saying that physical movement is optional now. And she says she's not just talking about walking, but periods of high intensity, lifting heavy things, being really physically active. It's no longer a prerequisite for being healthy, or it's no longer seen as being a prerequisite for being healthy. 40% of the individual is skeletal muscle. It's our largest endocrine organ, but it has become optional whether to use it or not. And she says it's not just obese people either. She says we're seeing more and more issues with lean people too. And these metabolic diseases that are on such an increase are starting in people's 20s and 30s now. So we're seeing issues with skeletal muscle a lot earlier. So Rangan asks, I always like this, he's very good at getting people to clarify and explain the terms they're using. So he says, so what is skeletal muscle? And what does she mean by it starting early? And how worried do we need to be in terms of motivating a change in our behaviour? And she says that skeletal muscle is the tissue you have voluntary control over, as opposed to things like the muscles that control digestion. So it's biceps and things like that. That's what we're talking about with skeletal muscle. And Rangan says that most people think of strength training, working out in the gym, lifting weights, etc. And that you start losing muscle mass from the age of about 30 unless you start doing something about it and actively building it. And Gabrielle comes back at this with, how do we grow it and maintain its health rather than when do we start losing it? From a very young age, we have the potential to grow muscle. The more active you are as a child, the better for muscle potential. And they talk about how important it is for children to be physically active. And there's a note on that later that we'll come to, a bit of a contrast between now and back in the day. Skeletal muscle is definitely affected by obesity, though, she says. The ability of the muscle to respond to dietary protein becomes blunted with obesity. The age we start to lose muscle depends on physical activity, and low levels of inflammation blunts skeletal muscle activity too. So can they be overcome with exercise and diet? Yes, but exercise is a much more potent stimulus than diet because of the physiological pressure that an individual can put on its tissue, which I found interesting because we often, I think it's often cited, isn't it? Or it has been at least, changing a bit now, but in the low carb and keto community, that more emphasis on diet than exercise. But she comes from a slightly different perspective. As we age, there's a natural phenomenon that happens called anabolic resistance. And anabolic resistance is a decrease in the efficiency of the skeletal muscle to recognize and use dietary protein. I think that's one of the reasons why she talks about the importance of upping protein as we get older. So the mechanism of stimulating the tissue becomes less. And that typically happens in your 40s. So you need to start eating differently protein-wise to keep stimulating that tissue. But when exactly it starts is variable, depending on all sorts of things, not least on how well you've taken care of yourself. Once anabolic resistance starts, it's harder to build muscle and stimulate that tissue. And it can happen at any age, she says. And she talks about marbled steak. Think about a marbled steak. She says it's the same with skeletal muscle tissue. It decreases its ability metabolically for glucose disposal. It decreases its contract out potential and its ability to turn over and repair. When it begins, it's much more difficult to recover from periods of inactivity than before. Rangan asks her about children and the importance of activity and developing muscle at a young age. Gabrielle says that children are anabolic. They don't require a meal threshold of protein. They are primed for activity and growth and are really resilient. Their muscle is not anabolically resistant. After growth happens, when we are no longer in that prime growth phase, there is a potential for anabolic resistance to start setting in. But you can overcome anabolic resistance. It's not a hopeless experience. As we age, we tend to get smaller, weaker, and we don't consider that we need to change our diet and activity to target this aging. She says this is the prime time to implement the strategies that she's going to talk about. And just because you can't see the changes, it doesn't mean they're not happening. And she talks about how the body is really resilient and it wants to have muscle. The healthier your muscle mass is, the better your survivability across all disease states. And low intensity training, things like walking and cardiovascular stuff is really good, is really important for mitochondria. But she says there's a huge need for a push for resistance exercise. which she says is non-negotiable. But there is also value for cardiovascular training. Skeletal muscle is an immune regulatory organ. It's not just about fitness or managing blood sugar. It's an immune modulatory organ. This is really interesting. It interfaces with the immune system. When you do cardiovascular exercise, interleukin 6 can increase 100-fold and can counterbalance the inflammatory mechanisms in the body. And she does talk more about what interleukin 6 is. So go and listen. And other things. So yeah, you really need to go and listen to the full episode. Way too much stuff to try and cover here. I'm just trying to whet your appetite. Rangan talks about how the human body is made up of all these systems that work together and how nothing works in isolation. And we already know, or anyone that's listened to him knows, that he has a very holistic approach to things and believes in digging out the root cause. So this is kind of obvious, but I do think it gets forgotten way too often. And we do tend to treat things often in isolation without considering what impacts and how things work together as a whole. They talk again about how muscle tends to be viewed as dumb muscle, Rangan says, just a physical thing we can see, but that it is an active organ, an endocrine organ. It's about a lot more than just getting buff. And it's actually more important the older you get. And so she has 3 practical things that she thinks you should be doing. The first one is once a week to do some form of HIIT, high intensity interval training. And he asks her to clarify this. What exactly is it doing to the skeletal muscle? So Gabrielle says that it's been well documented that HIIT is the primary driver, as related to exercise, to improve insulin resistance. And it does this by improving GLUT4 transport of glucose into skeletal muscle. You can lower insulin resistance just by leveraging skeletal muscle. I made a note here because I was making notes as I was listening about how I thought that HIIT was actually quite difficult to get right. I've read that. And also that what I mentioned just now about it's certainly something that I've heard quite a lot, although like I say, it does seem to be changing in the keto and low carb community, that diet is more important than exercise for achieving your goals. It's certainly something that I've said in the past and am now regretting a bit and rethinking. For me, it was all about the weight loss and I didn't consider the muscle loss. And I think I've probably paid for that quite dearly. Having said that, I think it does depend how heavy you are when you're starting your journey. But I'd be willing to bet that Gabrielle would still advocate for some form of exercise as being beneficial. And indeed she does. The thing about being really heavy, though, I made a note of this, is that even the lightest form of exercise can be quite heavy duty exercise. And I say that as someone who was very much heavier than I am now. I'm certainly not making a joke of it, but I used to joke that I was carrying my sister around with me everywhere I went because I worked out that the excess weight I had was the equivalent to my sister. So when I was morbidly obese, is what I was carrying around another person, but that made me quite strong. I bet that made my skeletal muscle pretty strong. But as I lost a significant amount of weight, I didn't counter that carrying somebody else around. And so adding that resistance in everything I didn't counter that by upping the strength training, upping the challenge on my muscles. And that's what I deeply regret because I have lost a lot of strength. And I'd be willing to bet if I went and did a DEXA scan or something that I significantly and negatively impacted my skeletal muscle in doing that. Because I do remember how strong I was. I found everything difficult, but I was strong. And I lost some of that.
It's such a great reminder of that. If you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, as I'm making my notes here, I did jump the gun a bit. Rangan asked the question, he's always good at asking the right questions, about relative fitness levels and weight challenges that people might have. And yes, what you're looking for here, she says, is a large contrast. So Gabrielle says, for some people, it might be going from sitting on a chair to standing up. It's about personal induced adaptation. As the person gets more fit, they can then do more. It's about intensive effort and then dropping back. This is the HIIT we're talking about, rinse and repeat, and for fairly short bursts. But it is personal to you what that looks like. The goal of exercise is inducing adaptation, she says. And she believes that the body is designed to do these things and that we have softened ourselves as a society. One of the reasons muscle health is not at the forefront, she maintains, is that it is not easy. Boom! Exclamation mark. I wrote, yeah, that's, I think that's a lot of what it comes down to. For me, it's not an easy thing to do. Often, actually, certainly once you got into the habit of changing your diet, it can be a whole lot easier than embarking on an exercise plan. And they're not so much part of our daily lives anymore, vigorous exercise. And they talk about children over the decades, and this is something I alluded to earlier, and what kids are able to do strength-wise and how that has considerably declined. The study they referred to was comparing kids in the 1970s, so that's my era when I was born in 1970, to about 2012. And I think it's true. When I think about it, I used to walk quite a distance to and from school. I was encouraged to go out and play a lot. Yes, I loved to watch TV, but I wasn't allowed to do it that much. Very restricted TV watching. And of course, we just didn't have the tech that kids have now. Entertainment was more usually active things, wasn't it? Going out on your bike, going out to play, climbing stuff, whatever it was. But a lot of it was quite physical. They also talked about average body weight and how much it has increased. And she was citing, I think, statistics from World War II and the average body weight difference, massive. And Rangan asked her, but what has that got to do with muscle? And she's saying we are now in a time of excess compared to the time that she was citing as a comparison, which was the 1940s. That was a time when we were generally more worried about starvation. It's not to say for 1 minute that people aren't going hungry today, they are, but as an average. Protein was prioritized and specifically prioritized for soldiers, which of course tells you something about strength and the need for it with strength. And muscle health was a priority. But now we have an overall excess consumption, but flooded with low quality, quite calorific foods that do nothing for muscle health. And, you know, people are talking about this left, right and centre, aren't they? The massive increase in low quality, ultra processed junk. That is also sadly highly palatable, more often than not. But back to the practical tips. So the first one was doing HIIT once or twice a week. The second one is strength training, resistance training, 3 to 4 times a week. Rangan asked her, what does she mean by that? And what does it do for skeletal muscle? And how does it compare to HIIT? We directly have the ability to impact the organ that is skeletal muscle. It's very plastic. Resistance training creates metabolic stress, mechanical stress, and turnover and growth of new protein. It allows the rest of the body to function in a way that we can burn more calories through exercise. Everyone wants to burn more calories, don't they? So if you can get more bang for your buck, that's going to be a good thing. The goal with resistance exercise is hypertrophy, which is muscle growth. The good news, in a way, is that this is easy to do and make a significant change and add muscle mass. The less fit you are, it becomes harder to keep adding muscle mass the fitter you get. I can remember somebody else talking about this, Wendy Suzuki maybe. And she talks about it, which is another one of her phrases I like. She talks about it as building body armor. Muscle, she says, is an amino acid reservoir, and the healthier it is, the capacity to dispose of glucose and increase total caloric expenditure improves. And they talk about how some women are a bit fearful of putting on too much muscle, and that to them is not cosmetically appealing. And Gabrielle laughs and says, actually, it's really difficult to do that. But then she defines more that what she means by the importance of hypertrophy and how she thinks of this is not about how we look, but thinking about skeletal muscle as body armor and all the things it can do to protect us and help us live longer. It can be the first thing to go because the body in need uses this reservoir of amino acids. So resistance training is all about hypertrophy, but not as it relates to what you look like in a bikini. Of course, that can be important to some people too, not negating that, but it's about the medicine that muscle provides us. Rangan picks up on this body armor image and talks about how, to his mind, the word that came to his mind was resilience. And he says that presumably it not only reduces the likelihood of injury, but it also then improves your recovery rate if you do get injured, and could potentially save you. And she cites an example of a friend of hers who's a cyclist who really focused on resistance training as well as the obvious cardiovascular training he was doing all the time. And he was in a horrific traffic accident. And to cut long story short, the surgeons, the people who were working on him, said the reason he survived was because of the muscle he had built. Because it took him something like a year to be able to walk again and things. So he lost a lot of muscle, but because he had significantly built it before, it literally saved his life. And this doing it 3 to 4 times a week, what does that mean? Do we need dedicated training, even if we're fairly active already? He talks about, people who maybe walk to the shops and carry back their heavy bags of shopping. And she says, yes. She talks about things like that as being a baseline, but how we need to think about challenging our body and creating a stimulus for growth. So again, it's relative. And our body has a natural tendency to atrophy without physical challenge. Growth is key. So you can't just keep doing the same thing. You need to push your body to a level that's uncomfortable. And obviously, the fitter you get, the more challenging that's going to be. So to start with, it's quite easy to put on muscle mass. And also then, she says, to maintain it, relatively easy. But for hypertrophy, so to keep building, to keep gaining muscle, it depends on a lot of factors, like age, for example. And she says you should have at least one, and this is where she says, she doesn't mince her words. You should have at least 1 to 2 workouts a week that you do not want to do because they're too hard and they suck. I'm liking you less, Gabrielle Lyon. But she talks about the volume, frequency, duration, and her recommendation is 3 to 4 days a week as a baseline. That's not necessarily optimal. And she talks about, especially when you're starting, focusing on multi-joint compound movements. So things like squats, deadlifts, full body movements, rather than isolated activities like bicep curls. She says not that they aren't valuable, but at least to start with, it's best to do these multi-joint movements. And the amount of exertion is important and relative. All body parts should be worked at least twice a week. So she does have quite high standards, but anything is better than nothing. So, Rangan is encouraging you don't get overwhelmed by her recommendations. And actually that low starting point will give you some decent results pretty quickly. And they do talk a little bit about higher intensity. The higher the intensity, actually, the less time you need to put in. But she says that's more, you can start tweaking that a bit further down the line. Rangan asks her if there are certain personality types that strive and some that struggle. And she says, okay, this is going to be another unpopular opinion. She's quite outspoken, I think. I like her for that. She says what she thinks, even if it maybe goes against the grain sometimes. She says that we've created a narrative in our culture that stress is bad, that fight or flight is what stress is. But there are other stress responses, and you've touched on this. I think we both have in other episodes. But like the courage response, for example, the befriend response. And she thinks of these as the default response and what we are designed to thrive on, and that we are actually designed to thrive on the kind of stress that is challenge. Do we need to push hard? She says. Yes. Those individuals she's found with all her clinical work, those individuals who do the best over time, leverage, embrace, and lean into discomfort rather than turning away from it. I think that might be one of my biggest problems. But cardiovascular, and whenever they say their lists, the 3 things, they never actually mention the third thing. But I think the third thing is cardiovascular, because they do talk about it a few times and the importance of it, but she doesn't specifically cite it as the third thing. But he talks about how he does the park run every week, which is a 5K run here in the UK, as the name implies, usually in a park. Here it's along the seafront, but it's an organised activity every Saturday morning, and he does it every week with his son, and it's just something they do together and enjoy. And he asks her how this kind of activity fits in with her way of thinking, and she says it's also non-negotiable. Cardiovascular endurance activities, great for mitochondria, and she recommends 150 minutes a week. So what's that? 2.5 hours?
I used to like her.
Quite a lot. I know. And they talk about raising kids. I think his children are a bit older than hers, but they talk about raising them and making all these things part of the family culture, trying to make them fun. She says how easy it is for children to put on and maintain muscle. So definitely this is the time to build a default position for exercise, and particularly this real mix of different kinds of exercises just being the norm, being the baseline as you grew up. And it wasn't really too much for me. My mum wasn't a fan of exercising, so they talk a lot about modeling, parents modeling behavior, and I do think that's important, although obviously we quite often go against our parents, but that's another thing. So like I say, they don't mention specifically the third thing, but I think it's a cardiovascular baseline stuff. And he does ask, when they're talking about this decline in skeletal muscle, is there a difference between men and women? And she says that women typically have lower muscle mass than men. It's just the way it is, comes down to size, and less anabolic hormones like testosterone. But women see a big decrease in muscle mass and strength around menopause when estrogen levels drop. But she says it doesn't have to happen. As estrogen goes down, women tend to move less overall. Things like fidgeting, for example. I thought that was interesting. She says if you up dietary protein, manage caloric intake, modify carbohydrate intake, and understand that carbs need to become a meal threshold ingestion, increase high activity, HIIT and resistance exercise, possibly take HRT. She says you can circumvent this decrease in skeletal muscle. But she says, a little word of warning here, there's more risk for injury as estrogen falls. So be careful with your training and think about the kind of exercises you're doing. Avoid things that might result in injury. And that doesn't mean everything, which is what came to my mind. But she says things like explosion of energy, things like box jumps, for example, can potentially easier to injure yourself. She did say to focus on the HIIT. She said this has a sort of bigger bang for your buck in menopause. And cardiovascular, good to have as a baseline, but hypertrophy is key, she says. We're running out of time, so I won't go into this too much, but as I said at the beginning, people who know her will know she's big on protein. Protein is her big thing. And she has some really, really interesting things to say about it, about how much you need to have. She goes into quite a lot of detail about the importance of the amount of protein you have in the first meal of the day. And she does say that, and that doesn't matter when it is, but the fact that you're going into that fasted, you're going into it in a catabolic state, you need to hit a 30 to 55 gram protein amount to set the ball rolling, to get this anabolic stimulus kicked off. And she says, if you take this advice, you will change the trajectory at which you age. And that is that this first meal of the day has to have You have to hit this threshold. If you're sub-threshold, you will not stimulate the tissue. And she goes into detail about why this 30 grams is important, talks about leucine and other amino acids, the difference between plant proteins, animal food proteins. Really, really interesting, really quite important, I think. Just briefly, before I finish about that, she talks about a carbohydrate threshold. And the reason behind that is just it's very difficult to dispose of, and it can potentially increase with more activity. And I know we'll be preaching to the choir on that one, so don't need to go into any detail about that. But I've skipped over the food bit a little bit at the end there, but really interesting. I really recommend you go and listen to this podcast, probably also the book. For me, this pretty well 2-hour podcast episode was a taster that made me want to go and listen to the book and get into far, far more detail on all the things. So I'm quite excited to go and listen to her talk a lot more about all this. So I know I've just thrown stuff at you without really giving you a chance to say anything, but I was trying to pack as much of the episode in as I could.
That's okay. One of the thoughts I had as I was listening, and I've seen her speak at a conference before, I'm just so aware that every expert comes to the table with a little bit of silo thinking. Mm-hmm. Because in my work, we talk a lot about fasting and how to eat differently. And then, she's going to come at it from a little bit of a different angle. Mm-hmm. And I think the important thing for me, and maybe for others, is as you listen to experts, I know there's danger in cherry picking and only choosing parts of what they say, but recognizing they are giving information generally, and then you have to kind of pare it down of how does this fit for me with the other things that I'm working on? Mm-hmm. Because instantly I started thinking about how much protein and how does that fit for me? And, am I different than the type of people she's normally talking to about this? Or are those numbers the right numbers for me? And so I think it always brings up for me the complexity of the balancing act that we're all trying to figure out when it comes to movement and eating and not eating, and that there's really this delicate balancing act to find. So I love hearing someone like this, and I love you sharing it because there's so much to be thinking about in making decisions about any of these things. And yes, I need to do more intense exercise. I've told you that I'm doing my squats, and I thought that was going to be enough for my muscle building. But clearly, I also need to be doing some other things to really keep my muscle and protect my health. I like that you focused on that so much, Daisy, is that it's not just about, okay, let's go build some muscle, but it's really about protecting our health. I didn't realize the piece that you shared about the immunity and how important our skeletal muscle is in our immune system functioning. That's fascinating to me. And it also makes sense that as we think about people aging and losing some of that skeletal muscle, they are more susceptible to getting sick. They go into the hospital and they get very sick. And I'm sure there are other reasons as well. But I never would have made a connection that amount of muscle, quality of muscle in our body could play a role in that. So I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, funnily enough, one of the novels I was listening to recently mentioned it just as a sort of passing comment, really, that one of the reasons why the person was recovering so well was the fact that they had a lot of muscle. For them, it was like rock climbing and things, but that it was an important factor in their recovery. And you're right. I think you mentioned about this sort of silo thinking, and there were quite a few things that she mentioned, and the protein intake actually for me was one of them that I found it interesting what she had to say. And it's one of the reasons why I want to go on to listen to the book, because I want to hear more about it. I want to hear about the science behind it. I want to hear where she's coming from to say the things that she was saying that she can't give all the background information, she can't give the science to in a podcast, even though it was a 2-hour podcast. She can't give all the information that I need. But the key message that I took from it, yes, there was a threshold that she talks about, but she was saying that it was really important in that first meal. And so I really want to hear more, because I've also heard different things from the different editing I do and the different things I watch and listen to. So I want to hear more from her about that, and whether it is a globally thing that can be applied, or whether it does just apply to certain people, and all the other things. And they talk about how individual it is. So I'm sure that, as well as many other things, is just as individual. And Rangan always brings it back just to remind us, this all sounds a bit big and overwhelming, and oh, Gabrielle, we thought we liked you, and now you're saying all these things we've got to do to optimize our health. But he always brings it back to, starting off with your 5 minutes of squats a day that's where you start. So that's what I need to keep reminding myself. I still don't know what it is that will kick me into doing what I need to do, but I suspect the more I listen to Gabrielle, maybe the more, the closer I'll get to it. I will let you know after I've listened to her book.
Well, Daisy, I was not thinking this was going to be a book I would probably want to read, but I'm really fascinated by so many things that you shared today that I definitely think I need to at least listen to the longer episode and get to kind of dig into these things more. But I really am looking forward to hearing you talk about the book.
I will tell you all about it.
Right.
So until I see you next week, I hope you have, and everyone else at home has, a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone. Do your HIIT, do your strength building, get out there and move.
At least make a start.
That's right. Bye-bye.